This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back this week. And this week we're going to take on a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about CEOs that stay in the boardroom after their tenure as a CEO. And I have a guest who is going to be experienced with that and wants to talk to the issue. And it's an issue that certainly has a little bit of controversy to it. But let me welcome my guest. Marvin "Skip" Schoenhals is the chairman with WSFS Bank in Wilmington, Delaware. And Skip, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You know, this issue is controversial in the sense that, you know, governance gurus say one of the things they want to see is when the former CEO is done with their tenure, there might be a short stint on the board, and then the new CEO has to have the freedom to do their thing. In your case, and let's start with that. Why don't you explain exactly what happened in the bank's case, and then what the sequence of events was that led you to chairman?
I had been chairman, president, and CEO of WSFS for a number of years, almost 16 years, when we made the succession plan, or implemented a succession plan, where I am now chairman of the board, still sit on the board, and we have an internal person who moved up to be president and CEO. And that actually happened about 4 years ago. And it was the result of a succession planning process that the board and I had gone through 5 years before we actually did this. And we knew that, yes, the experts say that the old CEO ought to exit stage left as soon as he or she steps down from that position. We thought that a combination of things, that because of my background and experience and the stability of the organization, that it would make sense for me to stay on the board. But we had a very important fundamental ground rule from the very first day we started discussing that. And that was that Mark, who is my successor as president and CEO, that he was the future of the company, and he was the management of the company. And from a management perspective, I was history. I was now going to be responsible for running the board, not for running the bank. And as we discussed this fact that many people would recommend not doing what we were going to do, what the board and I agreed to was that the board had to constantly assess whether I was in any way interfering with Mark as the CEO. And by prior agreement, all they had to say is, Skip, you're interfering with him as CEO, and I was gone. And so it was a very clear understanding of what the danger was of the approach that we were taking, and putting a process in place, or an agreement in place, that said, here's how we're going to deal with that very legitimate concern that I could have ended up influencing Mark in a negative way, or preventing him from being the leader that he is.
Okay, well, let's take that's the opening key, okay, to that. Let's talk about your relationship with Mark and the other keys that are important to making that successful, because let's take the most obvious circumstance, okay? The new CEO wants to change something that the old CEO has put into place.
And Mark's done a little bit of that too, by the way.
But let's look at the other keys that has dealt with situations like that and has made this successful.
I think the most fundamental key is there has to be incredible respect between the two individuals involved. I respected Mark as my successor, and he respected me as chair. And I made the transition that my future wasn't hung up in proving that I was a really good CEO. That chapter was over with. And so I wanted to step back and do everything I could to help Mark become the best CEO that our company has ever had. I hope he's a better CEO than I do, because I'm a shareholder, and that's a great leadership legacy. If somebody that succeeds me, that's better than me, that I had some small part in helping that person become who they are, that's a great legacy behind. And on the other hand, Mark wasn't hung up that he had to prove that he was the CEO and that he didn't need any advice. So he was more than willing to walk into my office and say, Skip, I've never faced this before. What would you do? And so it was that mutual respect for each other and recognizing that we each had a uniqueness that had to be allowed to flourish. And we didn't have to prove anything to each other. And incumbent on this decision is something that I was fortunate enough to have an insight on very early, that I was changing jobs, and being chairman of the board is not being the president and CEO. The president and CEO gets to set the day-to-day priorities going on in a company, not the chairman. And so I used to do that. But just like when you get promoted, you don't keep doing your old job. You go to your new job. And that was key to me to realize that there would be some days where I disagree with the priorities Mark was setting, but that went with the territory. If I wasn't prepared to put up with that, then I shouldn't have been willing to do this. And that, to me, those two things, the respect and the recognition on the outgoing CEO, who is now the chair, has to realize that he or she is in a completely different role now. Their job is to mentor and counsel that CEO, not in any way to interfere with the decisions he or she wants to make.
Some can do it, some can't do it.
And that's back to where the board has to constantly, even to set this up, has to assess the temperament of the two individuals. And then they have to be willing to deal with it if, in fact, they've assessed it wrong.
One of the keys to this is you had a long relationship with Mark prior to this event happening, and like you said, it was a 5-year plan just in the succession.
That's correct.
So that is different than a new person being recruited in as well. I'm sure that it would be much more difficult in that setting.
I agree with that, TK. In fact, in the sessions you and I were in earlier in the day, as people were talking a little bit about this issue, I think an outsider coming in, this would be a more difficult challenge. Not impossible, but certainly more difficult where there hadn't been the long rapport that Mark and I had built up together.
Well, and the Mark that we're talking about is Mark Turner.
Mark Turner,
I guess we should identify that. For
President and CEO of WSFS.
Yes.
My favorite president.
Yeah. and one of my favorite banks.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that I'm allowed to play favorites, but
well, you have a little heritage there as well.
That's right. So let me ask the more difficult question. So you get into this position as chairman.
Yes.
Tell me the issue that sort of was enlightening, that you didn't know that it would be, that turned out to be more positive than you had suspected it might be in this evolution. And then on the other side, tell me the thing that...
The mistakes I made?
Well, just what ended up to be a challenge that you may not have anticipated that you had to work through.
I think to answer the first question, it's just been a marvelous success, and I've been very pleased with the way the board's behaved, the way Mark and I have behaved, and as we've just come through a very difficult economic time, to have the wisdom that hopefully I represent because of my history in banking present on the board during this very difficult time, I think the company would have been a bit worse off without the wisdom of somebody like myself who has managed through many situations like this. On the negative side, in spite of my best intentions, every now and then I slip back into a CEO mode in board meetings, not walking around the bank. I absolutely would not in any way interfere that way. But in board discussions where a board member might be questioning a subject or exploring a subject, more than once I've probably started to answer it like I was management. And Mark and I have just talked about that when it's happened, and he reminds me of my commitment, and I say, yep, that's right, and I probably should have kept my mouth shut at that point in time. But nothing, we haven't had any blow-ups or anything like that. But again, every now and then I forget that I'm not the CEO.
Well, I should disclose that I did communicate with Mark prior to this, and he has confirmed everything that you have said. So you're not speaking outside of school here. Skip, we have about a minute left.
Okay.
What would you say to all those people that are watching now, and particularly the governance gurus, or as we heard, the proxy shareholder advisors that sort of look at this sometimes as a negative? But what would you say to them? Because here you are, a bank that's the only independent bank left in Wilmington, Delaware.
And the 7th oldest bank in the country as well.
So
let me just jump in on that and say, to have a hard and fast rule on this is like all hard and fast rules with respect to complex situations. In my opinion, there should not be a hard and fast rule. The rules ought to be assess the situation, do what's best for the company under the given circumstances, and then have a diligent board, particularly where you make a decision like we made, that says we need to make sure we watch out for the negatives of what could come from the approach we're taking.
Well, good advice. Interesting situation.
Thank you.
I'm familiar, and I know how successful you've been, so obviously you're doing something right.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure.
And that concludes this week's edition of This Week in the Boardroom, and we will look again next week at another topic that will help you be a better board member or committee member, and we will see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.